Hello everyone, and welcome to the first e-lecture this year in 10th grade cultural history. It is my hope through these videos that you have a chance to take the notes home and to be able to watch this whenever you need to study or you need to review your notes. And I hope that you also get a chance to go over your notes several times while you are watching this video. Today we're talking about King Louis XIV in France and his rise and ascent to power. What he does early on in his reign to cement himself as one of France's most impactful leaders. Now, before we continue, we have to review absolutism. What we know about medieval kings, and there are many of them out there, medieval kings faced many checks on their power. This includes the church and the nobility, representative bodies such as the Estates General in France or Parliament or in England, universities that were controlled by the church, and absolutists, or people who believed in a government that is run by an absolute monarch. The goal of the absolutists was sovereignty, supreme and independent power, totally. So total independent power of a country or a kingdom. And so that is the idea that gives way to Louis XIV. Now, what we know about monarchs in France leading up to Louis XIV is that they were incredibly ineffective. They were incredibly bad, and they were just really bad kings. Unremarkable, to say the least. Now, King Louis XIII, Louis XIV's father, was another in the line of these unremarkable kings. Louis XIII has Louis XIV rather late in his life. Louis XIV is born, and then just four short years later, his father passes away, thus giving Louis XIV the throne at the age of 4, making him what we call a boy king for sure. We also know that during the reign of King Louis XIII, he is a chief minister. His name is Cardinal Richelieu. Now, we consider Richelieu to just be much more important than Louis XIII when it comes to this reign. Now, Cardinal Richelieu is the person that really runs France. He's the one that really makes sure Louis XIII's power is consolidated and make sure that it is strong. Richelieu is an absolutist. He believes that a king or a monarch is the one that should be leading the country and should be all power should be consolidated under one person. Now, Louis XIII dies in 1643. His child is 4 years old, and obviously you can't have a 4-year-old being king. It's just impossible. So Louis XIV has a couple of different people working for him to make sure that he is not overthrown as a child. The first is his mother, Anne of Austria. Anne of Austria serves as Queen Regent. That's a position where a mother oversees the throne or a country while her child grows up to be the king. But he also has Cardinal Mazarin, who is his chief minister. Now, Cardinal Mazarin, much like Cardinal Richelieu, were clergymen, worked in the church, and wanted to make sure that the king had significant power in France. Mazarin does a couple things early on. He ends the 30 Years' War, or France's involvement in the 30 Years' War. He also becomes hated by the French nobility. Mazarin raises taxes on the nobility. He strengthens the central government. He takes power away from the nobles. and really helps lay the groundwork for Louis's absolutism. Right, much like Louis the XIII's absolutism was, the groundwork was laid by Richelieu. Mazarin helps continue that process with Louis XIV. This leads to a major problem in France, which is called the Fronde. The Fronde is French for sling, like a slingshot, and it's a series of civil wars and a series of revolts of French nobles and peasants and merchants against Mazarin. Um, Louis was kind of sheltered from this. He definitely knew what was happening. He definitely knew that the Fronde was something that was taking place, but we don't think that he was given the full extent of the information. But it does come to traumatize young Louis, and he swears that when he becomes king, that he will never let this happen again. It really prepares Louis for a lifelong fear of rebellion, lifelong fear of people rising up against him, and he does what it takes when he becomes fully in power. He does what it takes to stop that and make sure that he can continue to reign. So Louis never wanted the Fronde or a situation like the Fronde to happen again. And so he knew that he had to make sure that his reign as king was larger than life. That it was so big, and that he was so big as the king that nobody would ever challenge him. So Louis takes the throne, and he will go on to reign for 72 years. He's the longest reigning king in European history. And Louis really sets the style for European monarchs. He was lavish, he was powerful, he had the nicest things in the nicest palace, and he was the king that others really looked up to in terms of his style and the power that he developed in France. Louis's goal, one of them, we'll talk more about some others in a couple minutes, but Louis's goal was to make the monarchy incredibly important and a very powerful political institution of France. The most powerful political institution. Forget the nobility. Forget the church. Louis wanted to be the most powerful political institution. And he also wanted to make sure that other nobles and other wealthy groups that they could have influence locally, that they kept their social status, but they knew who was in charge and they knew who was boss, and that was Louis's goal, to rule and to make sure the nobles knew who was really boss. And so Cardinal Mazarin dies in 1661, and Louis takes the throne. He was 23 years old. He does not appoint another chief minister, and instead he rules through different councils. He rules through councils that control foreign affairs and domestic affairs, and he really takes control of the entire government of the country of France. One of the most interesting phrases that Louis utters about himself and his kingdom is the phrase "L'état c'est moi." Say that again in French. L'état c'est moi. Now, l'état c'est moi, if we translate it directly, it means I am the state. And we really have to break that idea down a little bit. In this one sentence, in this one idea, Louis puts himself at the center of his country. He puts himself at the center of the government. I am the state. I am the government. Everything is going to run through me. And that's really how Louis runs his government. That's how he runs that's how he runs everything. Everything goes through Louis. L'état c'est moi. And it's a phrase that's going to keep coming back to um, really define what Louis does in power. Louis's goals, like I mentioned, he has many, many goals. Um, but if we were to break them down very simply, Louis's goals in power is to establish this idea of one king, one law, and one faith. And almost immediately upon taking complete control of government, these are the things that come to define the kingdom, the reign of Louis XIV. Now, when it comes to one king and one law, Versailles is really one of the places where Louis tries to establish this. Louis and his advisors are masters of propaganda. They're masters of creating and altering imagery for his benefit. Louis was always trying to show how grand and how lavish his lifestyle was. To the French people, sure, but mostly to the French nobility. He really wanted the nobility to see that he was doing good and that they needed to follow him because of how grand he was. Louis also looked to manipulate symbols or emblems. The one that Louis chooses is the sun. Now, previous to this, France had used, or French kings had used the symbol of a fleur-de-lis, or a flower, to symbolize their monarchy. Not Louis. Louis says, I'm going to establish a symbol that is over everything, awe-inspiring. Everything rotates around this thing. And then he chooses the sun. Now, there's also... when Louis was a kid, he was a ballet dancer. He performed once as Apollo, or the sun god, and so we think there's some sort of connection to that as well. But the Sun King, calling himself the Sun King and taking on the sun as his symbol, Louis really establishes himself as, the thing that the rest of his country was going to revolve around. He demonstrates that he could outspend his nobility at will, and that really happens at the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles is really the central image of this monarchy, and it's the largest secular structure in Europe. It's a gigantic palace. And Louis really uses it as a chance to exert control over the nobles. It's built between 1676 and 1708. It is massive in size. Could hold 12,000 horses in its stables. And Louis requires nobles to be there. Kind of one of those things. Yeah, keep your eyes on your enemy. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Louis thinks the nobles are, if they're going to try to overthrow him, they won't do it if they're staying in his palace, if they are eating in his dining rooms, if they are participating in things in Versailles. Louis thinks they won't try to overthrow him. He's probably correct in that, as he doesn't really ever face any sort of coup attempts. Now, Versailles uses it to, like I said, exert political control. Some nobles have to pay for their own residence, which takes away their money. Others required royal patronage to stay there. Either way, they were looking to Louis to continue to exist as a noble. They were dependent on Louis. Louis organized the everyday life of Versailles. Everything was organized to participate, to be a part of Louis's day. This includes elaborate etiquette and elaborate ceremonies. including the getting up ceremony, or levee, where nobles would fight to be the ones in the room when the king was woken up every morning. Nobles would fight to try to gain influence with the king throughout the day, including moments where they could whisper in his ear, have that brief one-on-one time, or even holding his candle at night as he fell asleep or got ready for bed. So the establishment of Versailles and the building of Versailles really was a way for Louis to control his nobles, to keep them below him, to establish himself as the sole king, as the leader of the country, and as the leader of this group of people. Louis also establishes one law. There's the Code of Louis that really, consolidates much of the law in France under Louis' thoughts and ideas. But Louis also takes control of the faith in France. Louis is a devout Catholic. He's not like his grandfather, Henry of Navarre, who sees church and state as two separate things. Louis really sees himself as a Catholic and believes that his country needs to conform under one religion. So even after Henry of Navarre has promoted the Edict of Nantes, relations between the Catholics and the Protestants were not very good. Huguenots were losing population quickly. The French Catholic Church had supported their general persecution throughout this time. And so Louis wants to unite France religiously. He wants to unite the country under one God. Why does he do this? Some say love. But Louis really goes to ban the Huguenots out of public life. He bans them from government office. He excludes them from doing certain jobs, such as printing or medicine, and he uses financial incentives to convert them to Catholicism. Yes, I'm sure. I can't imagine being paid to switch to churches, but the Huguenots do. In October of 1685, Louis revokes the Edict of Nantes, so the Huguenots no longer could worship freely. Protestant churches and schools are closed. Religious repression and persecution begins. Ministers are exiled. Non-conforming lay people were condemned to be galley slaves, meaning they were going to go on ships and row the ships for merchants and whatnot. This is really it depends on how you look at it, right? It's a blunder in the idea that France goes on to lose 250,000 skilled people and 250,000 people who could make a difference in their country. But at the same time, it establishes one faith. And it goes to Louis' goal of establishing one king, one law, and one faith. So France becomes a very, very Catholic country, a country that does not tolerate other faiths outside of Catholicism. And Louis continues on his path of absolutism. Now, as we continue on, talking about Louis XIV, we have to mention the fact that Louis will go on and fight many wars throughout Europe, and that will be the subject of my next e-lecture. I hope you enjoyed. Please make sure that you complete your guided notes so that we know that you took part in this activity. Have a great night. I will see you in class tomorrow.